They say no man can look upon the golden throne and live, but I have seen its shadow. I have walked the pilgrim tunnels beneath the palace, where incense and blood mingle in the recycled air, and the prayers of 1,000 Psykers are devoured every day. I remember the sound first, the choir screaming in perfect unison, a sound that wasn't a sound at all, but pressure, radiance, annihilation. When my name was called, I stepped forward barefoot onto the gilded steel, my breath crystallizing in the freezing sanctum light. They told us this was glory, to feed the flame that keeps humanity alive. Yet as the light reached through me, as my thoughts began to burn away, I wondered, is the Emperor truly fed by faith, or by the silence that follows? If the echoes of this story draw you deeper into the halls of the Imperium, remember to keep the channel's flame alive. Like, share, and subscribe, so the Emperor's light may reach further across the dark. The air tasted of dust and sanctity. I had walked for 6 days beneath the vaults of the Terran underhives, each step carrying me closer to the place where men were unmade and offered to a god who had not spoken in 10,000 years. The crowds thickened the deeper we went. Pilgrims, penitents, the condemned, a river of flesh that moved without will, pressed forward by faith or fear. Vox horns high in the passageways bellowed canticles of devotion, the same lines repeated until words lost meaning and became rhythm. Heartbeat, obedience. Somewhere above us, the sky of terror was ash-colored and unreachable. Here, there was only the glow of lumen strips that flickered like dying candles. The walls sweated rust. I had once been told that this place, the pilgrim approach to the Astronomicon, was sanctified, but it smelled like an abattoir, like blood scrubbed but never forgotten. I clutched the parchment that bore my designation. Psykana candidate 44421B. A number soon to be erased, as all things are when they come before the throne. I tried to remember my name, my mother's face, the sound of wind over the ocean fields of my birth world. But the Adeptus Astra Telepathica had taken those memories apart piece by piece during screening. Every test, every probe, every sleepless night in the Scholastia Psykana had stripped another layer from my mind until only fragments remained. Perhaps that was mercy. The Emperor demands purity, and memory is corruption. We moved through the pilgrim gates in silence, guided by servo skulls that drifted on thin trails of incense smoke. A custodian guard stood at the archway, immobile, his auramite armor gleaming like a fragment of sunlight trapped in steel. His helm turned as we passed, the eyeslets alive with the dim red glow of judgment. None dared meet his gaze. To see a custodian is to feel the measure of your own insignificance. Beyond the gate, the tunnel sloped downward. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the low-frequency hum of ancient machinery. Each vibration sank into my bones. I imagined I could hear the pulse of the Golden Throne itself, a relic so vast and sacred that even the thought of it was a sin of presumption. The adepts say that the throne's machinery is the bridge between man and God, that through it, the Emperor's will radiates across the void. But others whisper that it is not a bridge but a prison. A child stumbled ahead of me, barely old enough to understand where she was. Her eyes were wide, white with terror. A robed attendant pulled her back into line, whispering a prayer that sounded more like a warning. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that it would be all right, but the words would not come. My throat was dry as ash. We are taught that to serve is joy, that sacrifice is honor. But honor feels different when you can smell the incinerators and hear the faint screaming behind sealed adamantine doors. At intervals, picked sensors displayed images of the Emperor, the same serene, radiant visage repeated in 1,000 variations. His eyes were always closed. In one mural, his hands reached outward, light spilling from his palms to touch the stars. In another, he was seated upon his throne, surrounded by angels of fire. I tried to believe that he saw us, that he knew our names even as they were erased from every record. But the silence that filled those tunnels was vast, and faith alone seemed too small to bridge it. When we reached the final descent, the adepts handed us relics, small bronze aquilus, crudely cast, still warm from the forge. For the soul's passage, one intoned, placing it into my palm. The metal burned against my skin, or perhaps it was my fear. Ahead, the light grew brighter, the air sharper. I heard chanting, the kind that vibrates the ribs and shakes the blood. The smell of ozone mingled with promethium smoke. The adepts told us that once we stepped beyond the next gate, we would never return. that what we were, human, flawed, finite, would be consumed by divine purpose. I tried to feel pride, to feel anything at all beyond the cold weight in my chest. But as the gate hissed open and the light of the Astronomicon poured through, one truth burned in me, clearer than any sermon. Every soul that comes to the golden throne walks here alone. The chamber beyond was impossibly vast, an industrial cathedral buried beneath the crust of holy terror, its arches lost in mist and machinery. Steam coiled from vents set into the obsidian floor, and the scent of burned incense clung to the air like old blood. I could hear the engines of devotion all around, turbines thrumming, cogitators whispering, servitors dragging chains across the decking as they tended the machinery of sacrifice. Somewhere high above, the sound of a choir rose and fell in dreadful harmony, like the heartbeat of something too immense to comprehend. We were led by robed attendants whose eyes were hidden behind brass lenses. Each bore the insignia of the Adeptus Telepathica, stylized lightning bolts, the mark of sanctioned Psykers. Their movements were slow, deliberate, ritualistic. They said nothing, not to us or to each other. When they turned, the light caught the data slates chained to their belts, each one recording the names, numbers, and fates of the condemned. We were no longer pilgrims. We were inventory. The line split into narrow corridors. Each corridor ended at a sanctum door of burnished steel. I was pushed toward one, my aquila clutched so tightly that the edges bit into my palm. The attendant before me recited a benediction, not to bless me, but to cleanse himself of association. The words rolled through the rebreather grill of his mask in a mechanical monotone. May the throne accept your essence and preserve mankind. May your mind burn brightly in the Emperor's sight, then fade as he wills. Inside, the chamber was small and circular. A single lumen globe hung overhead, swaying slightly in the recirculated air. The walls were etched with sigils of warding, psychometric patterns meant to contain stray thought. I was told to kneel on the cold metal plate at the center and await further instruction. The door closed behind me with the finality of a tomb. Silence. Then, the soft whir of servo motors. From the shadows emerged a figure clad in crimson robes, a magos biologis, judging by the trailing mechadendrites tipped with scalpels and syringes. Its vox grill crackled as it spoke. Designation 44421B. Latent psychic resonance within acceptable threshold. You will serve. The word serve carried no warmth, no reverence, merely categorization. It extended a mechadendrite tipped with a needle of transparent glass through which a luminous fluid pulsed like captive lightning. The needle bit into my neck. The pain was sharp, chemical. My veins ignited with cold fire. I gasped, but the magos paid no mind. The ritual, it seemed, required no comfort. The fluid, they called it Psykers balm, stabilized our neural patterns for the coming ordeal. It was said to dull the pain of dissolution, though every face I had seen ahead of me had screamed nonetheless. Rise, the magos ordered. I obeyed. My limbs felt weightless, detached. The door opened again, revealing a platform suspended over a chasm that glowed with actinic light. I stepped forward onto the trembling grating. Below, an abyss of energy pulsed, conduits carrying psychic residue to the great machine beyond. Somewhere in that unending dark, the Emperor's will burned, and the light of the Astronomicon was born anew, with every life consumed. The platform shook as a convoy of servitors passed overhead, their bodies twisted into instruments of worship. Some bore reliquaries filled with the ashes of the previous day's offerings. Others carried the still living remains of Psykers, whose sacrifice had faltered. Failed minds wired into the circuitry to hum eternally. Each was a warning. The Emperor's mercy is not guaranteed. I caught sight of the next group being led forward, their eyes wide, their skin pale with fear. One stumbled, a man older than most, muttering prayers to a god he would never see. A custodian watched impassively from a raised dais. With a single gesture, the man was seized by servo claws and dragged screaming into the shadows. The line did not pause. No one dared look away. Somewhere deep within me, something cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but with the quiet surrender of a mind that realizes its end is already written. I was no longer afraid of dying. I was afraid of what would remain afterward. Would anything of me survive the throne's hunger? Would I be a thought in the Emperor's mind, or only the faintest spark of fuel consumed and forgotten? A chime rang through the chamber, deep and resonant, echoing through my bones. The attendants began to chant again. For the light of terror, for the flame of man. The words reverberated through the steel as though the world itself prayed along. I took a final breath of air, thick with incense and iron. The gate before me opened, revealing the passage to the choir chamber. My knees trembled, but I stepped forward, because this was the path we had been born for, because to turn away would mean something worse than death, because the Emperor demanded it. The light swallowed me whole. The light was not white, as I had imagined, but gold, a burning, impossible gold that seared through my eyelids and painted the inside of my skull with fire. It was the light of the Astronomicon, the beacon by which the Imperium sails through the night of the void. And yet here, at its source, it was no guiding star. It was a furnace, a devouring sun made of souls. I stumbled forward, half blind, the heat prickling my skin like 1,000 insect stings. Around me, figures in identical robes shuffled through the glare, their outlines trembling like candle flames. Each carried the same vacant expression, emptied of self, replaced by purpose. We were led by adepts whose silhouettes loomed like phantoms against the brightness. Their movements smooth, their voices monotone. Designation 44421B. Proceed to Choir Pit 47. The words came through a vox grill and lodged in my mind like an echo. I followed the sound, moving past endless rows of narrow channels cut into the floor, each lined with metal frames and restraint rigs. Psykers lay in them, thousands upon thousands, their bodies trembling, their mouths open in soundless screams. The air vibrated with psychic residue, fragments of thought, agony, and prayer, all bleeding into one another. The hum of it filled the space, thick and tangible, like a second atmosphere pressing down on every living thing. At the far end of the pit stood a massive structure, a dais of black adamantium crowned with a column of radiant machinery. Cables as thick as a man's torso snaked upward, disappearing into the vaulted gloom above. This, I realized, was one of the conduits to the Golden Throne. The Emperor's psychic call flowed through it, and into it we would pour ourselves, thought by thought, atom by atom. An attendant approached and gestured me toward an empty frame. The restraints gleamed wetly in the light. I hesitated. "Please," I heard myself whisper. "I served the Scholastia. I passed all tests. The attendant's head tilted slightly, the lenses of his mask glinting. "All serve," he replied, voice devoid of emotion. "That is the only measure." The metal was cold as death when I lay upon it. The restraints clamped shut with a mechanical hiss. For a moment, I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, desperate to escape. Above me, a servo arm lowered a halo of brass filigree, the psychic conductor. It settled against my temples with a click, and I smelled burning ozone. In the distance, a bell tolled. Once, twice, a third time. The choir began to sing. There are no words for that sound. It was not music, not speech, not anything mortal. It was a convergence. Billions of human minds stretched thin across the immaterium, their voices braided into a single note. It tore through me, dissolved me, and rebuilt me in the same instant. My thoughts came apart like threads in a storm, unraveling into light. I could taste the warp, cold and infinite, filled with whispers that were not words but meanings. Hunger, despair, longing, devotion. For one terrible heartbeat, I felt everything. The agony of those beside me, the fear of worlds burning at the edge of the galaxy, the prayers of the faithful echoing through the void. I saw the Emperor, not as the statues depict him, radiant and serene, but as a shape beyond comprehension, vast and wounded, bound to his throne by unending fire. His presence crushed the breath from me, yet I could not look away. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence was command enough. My body convulsed. Liquid light poured from my eyes. I felt my mind reach upward, drawn by the gravitational pull of that immense will. Around me, others screamed, not in terror, but in exultation. To them, this was transcendence. To me, it was annihilation disguised as faith. And still, I reached out, because the Emperor was everything. Because without him, there would be nothing. As the light consumed me, I thought I heard a voice, faint, human, impossibly distant. It whispered a name, my name. Then the sound was gone, replaced by the endless roar of eternity. The golden fire closed around me like a shroud, and the last thing I knew was the feeling of falling without end. into brilliance, into darkness, into him. There was no awakening, only the slow realization that I had not yet ceased to exist. The light was gone, replaced by a heavy darkness that pulsed and breathed like a living thing. I could not see, not truly, yet perception persisted. A vision without eyes, thought without body. The world was reduced to vibration, to currents of sound and memory that flowed through me like a river. Somewhere distant, voices chanted in tones I could no longer distinguish as words. The choir, their song still bound me. I could feel their minds brushing against mine. Fragments of consciousness, flickering and failing, merging into the great psychic lattice that sustained the Astronomicon. Every instant, thousands of new voices joined, each burning bright and vanishing as fuel for the Emperor's will. I tried to speak, but there was no mouth, no lungs. The thought dissolved before it could form. Yet the act of trying drew attention. A ripple passed through the choir, subtle but distinct, and I sensed other minds turning toward me. They pressed against my awareness, curious, searching, impersonal as a tide. You are new. The words were not sound but sensation, a pulse of comprehension shaped by a dozen voices at once. You are not yet bound. The realization struck like cold iron. I had not fully merged. Part of me still lingered, the last fragile fragment of self. I clung to it instinctively, afraid of the oblivion that waited beyond. Around me, the other souls hummed in perfect synchrony, their individuality long since burned away. To remain separate was agony, but to surrender meant extinction. In the black expanse of the choir chamber, flashes of light danced, the psychic signatures of those consumed by the process. Each flare marked the end of a life, the transformation of a human mind into a spark within the Emperor's beacon. The adepts called it sanctification. I saw it for what it was, the slow unmaking of everything human. I drifted through that storm of thought, trying to orient myself, to remember who I had been. A name surfaced, faint, cracked, almost meaningless now. Then an image, a woman's face, smiling through the mist of memory. My mother. Her voice reached me across the void, whispering a prayer she used to say before sleep. The Emperor protects. I wanted to believe her, but the Emperor did not feel like protection. He felt like gravity, vast, inexorable, and uncaring. His presence pressed upon the choir, bending every thought toward him. The sensation was unbearable. Love turned to compulsion, worship into hunger. The Emperor's will was not cruel, but it was absolute, and to resist it was to be crushed beneath its weight. I sensed others breaking around me, their minds fracturing as the tide of his attention swept over them. Their last emotions bled into me, terror, awe, relief. Some vanished quietly, dissolving like snowflakes in sunlight. Others screamed until their thoughts unraveled completely, leaving only echoes. The choir absorbed them all. The song shifted. The pitch climbed, resonating through the Imperium. I could feel it ripple outward, far beyond terror, cutting through the tides of the warp, across the stars. Astropaths and navigators would feel that pulse and align their senses to it, steering vessels safely through the madness of the void. Humanity's survival depended upon this suffering, upon our endless dissolution. That knowledge should have brought purpose. Instead, it brought despair. I tried to withdraw, to fold inward and hide within myself. The effort was like swimming against the pull of a collapsing sun. The Emperor's light filled everything. Thought itself became friction. And then, a voice unlike the others. Human, individual, alive. Hold fast. The sound was faint, but it struck through the static like a blade. I turned, or what passed for turning in that place. A figure took shape within the darkness, a blur of consciousness edged in blue fire. I could feel the weight of his mind, disciplined, scarred, ancient. You do not belong here yet, the voice said. Do not surrender. Not all who serve the throne are consumed. I tried to answer, but again there were no words. Only raw emotion, confusion, terror, a plea for meaning. The figure moved closer, its presence radiating steadiness. Listen to me. The choir is not death. It is the threshold. Many fall beyond it, but some endure. Endure. The word anchored me. I clung to it, though I could not understand how endurance was possible within this inferno of faith and pain. How? I managed to think, the question trembling across the psychic current. But before the figure could respond, the choir surged again. The voices rose in a single, unified scream of devotion. The light returned, brighter, harsher. The figure dissolved into the brilliance, and the world convulsed as the Emperor's will swept through us once more. My fragile fragment of self flickered, on the edge of extinction, and still, somewhere in that burning sea, I felt the echo of his words, endure. Endure. The word had been simple, yet it burned like a brand upon my consciousness, anchoring me as the tide of the Emperor's will surged once more through the choir. The song rose higher, a crescendo of agony and devotion that tore through thought and memory alike. Around me, minds disintegrated, their last emotions flashing like meteors before vanishing into the endless light. I felt each one go, a ripple of loss spreading through the psychic sea. Their dissolution became energy, their pain transmuted into the golden radiance that sustained humanity's navigation across the warp. In that conflagration, I began to sense the rhythm behind the chaos, the pulse of the Astronomicon itself. Each death fed the beacon, and each spark of consciousness became part of its unending flame. It was a terrible symmetry, yet within it I found the faintest semblance of order. The Emperor's silence was no longer emptiness but a presence, infinite, incomprehensible, yet strangely familiar. Time had no meaning here. Seconds could stretch into eternities or collapse into nothingness. I drifted within the song, feeling fragments of my identity peel away. My face, my name, my voice. What remained was something rawer, more elemental. The will to continue, to see this torment to its end. Through the glare, I saw other lights flicker, not yet extinguished, struggling as I did to remain distinct. They shimmered faintly, bound by invisible filaments of faith and desperation. One pulsed brighter than the rest, its resonance sharp and deliberate. I reached toward it, and in that moment our thoughts brushed. A woman's voice entered my mind, trembling but resolute. You can still feel, barely. The response formed from instinct rather than language. Then hold to that. It fades if you let it. They told us it was a blessing. Her thought fractured, breaking into static pain. But I think it's something else. A test. Before I could ask what she meant, a shockwave rippled through the choir. The golden light flared, and a psychic scream tore through the Imperium. One of the conduits had failed. I could feel it. A surge of uncontrolled energy as hundreds of Psykers burned out at once. The scent of ozone and charred flesh reached even through the haze of my half-existent senses. The choir wavered, the song faltering before the adepts reasserted control. In that momentary fracture, I saw beyond the veil, a glimpse through the warp itself. Vast shapes moved within it, older than humanity. Drawn to the beacon's radiance like predators to blood, shadows coiled and retreated, their hunger palpable. I understood then why the Emperor must feed endlessly. The light of the Astronomicon was both shield and lure. To falter would be to invite those horrors to terror's doorstep. The choir stabilized. The song resumed. The adepts repaired the flow, their prayers echoing through the sanctum. Yet I could still feel the aftershock, the residue of 1,000 souls extinguished in an instant. The Emperor's light flared brighter for it. The paradox was unbearable. The woman's voice returned, fainter now. We keep him alive by dying. We keep us alive, I answered. A pause. Sorrow made manifest. Does he even know we're here? I hesitated, uncertain whether the thought was blasphemy or truth. He knows everything, I sent back, though even as I did, I felt the hollowness of it. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Then her presence dimmed, fading into the luminous tide until I could no longer tell which spark had been hers. I was alone again. Alone, and yet part of everything. And for the first time, I began to sense the faint thread of meaning in the suffering. Not comfort, not redemption, but necessity. The Imperium endured because it must, because to stop was to collapse into the night. Every life burned here was another day bought for billions elsewhere. But the cost was infinite. The song swelled again, and I felt my consciousness begin to drift toward the deeper current, where individuality dissolved completely. My mind wavered on the edge, torn between surrender and defiance. Then, faintly, I heard it once more. The voice from before, the one who had told me to endure. There is more to see, it whispered, beyond the throne, beyond the flame. But you must not break before the truth reveals itself. And before I could respond, the light surged again, and I was pulled downward, deeper into the golden fire that would carry me to the very heart of the Emperor's radiance. The descent into the golden current felt endless. There was no ground, no sky, no air, only the slow collapse of self into something vaster, an ocean of light where thought became motion and emotion became sound. I could not tell whether I was falling or rising. Gravity itself seemed to have no meaning here. What tethered me still was not faith, but the memory of the word endure, a thin filament cutting through the brilliance like a single thread of shadow in the sun. As I drifted deeper, the light grew colder. The gold dimmed to amber, then to the color of cooling metal. Shapes began to coalesce in the distance, titanic forms suspended in the radiance, their outlines shifting like heat mirages. They were not physical things, yet they had presence, lingering imprints of Psykers long consumed by the throne. Their echoes drifted here, caught between oblivion and worship. One of them turned toward me. It was faceless, a humanoid silhouette woven from threads of molten light. Yet I felt the weight of an identity long forgotten. When it spoke, the sound was the whisper of countless voices speaking as one. Do not fight it. The throne does not destroy, it absorbs. You will become purpose. I recoiled, though in this place motion had no form. Purpose is not life, I thought back. Purpose cannot feel. The entity pulsed, its brightness intensifying. Feeling is corruption. The Emperor's will purifies. There was no malice in its tone, only conviction. The kind that comes when faith replaces doubt so completely that truth no longer matters. I realized then that these were the remnants of those who had surrendered willingly, the sanctified fragments of Psykers who had accepted their dissolution and become part of the Emperor's chorus. Their serenity was terrifying. Why am I still separate? I asked, though the question was more prayer than defiance. Because you remember, came the answer, and memory is resistance. The light surged again, washing through me, searing away what little I still called I. Faces flickered through the radiance. People I had known, people I had forgotten. Their eyes were hollow, their smiles serene. They mouthed the same words. The Emperor protects. Each repetition stripped another layer from my soul, until I felt transparency approaching, dissolution complete. Then the current shifted. A shadow cut across the light. It was the figure from before, the one who had told me to endure. His presence was stronger now, sharper, as though drawn into this place by my nearing collapse. Around him the light twisted, bending like fabric around a wound. You are close to the core, his voice echoed. Few come this far with their will intact. What is this place? I asked, though the answer already trembled at the edge of knowing. The threshold of the Emperor's thought, he replied. The choir feeds his light, but some remnants drift too near. They see what should not be seen. I could feel the strain in his essence, the way his form wavered at the edges. He was not supposed to be here either. What happens if we see it? A pause. Then, we stop believing. The words reverberated through me like a wound reopening. But faith is what sustains him, I said. And yet, he answered, he endures whether we believe or not. That is the truth they hide from the faithful, that the Emperor's light burns because it must, not because we feed it. The sacrifices, they are not devotion, they are maintenance. The concept felt blasphemous, impossible. The entire Imperium, every act of worship, every death offered to the throne. Maintenance? Could the God Emperor truly be nothing more than a machine sustained by flesh and soul? You lie, I whispered, though there was no conviction behind it. He did not deny it. Perhaps, or perhaps lies, are all that keep the Imperium from tearing itself apart. The truth does not matter, only endurance. The light around us convulsed, as though aware of the intrusion. The choir screamed, a single piercing note that shook the foundation of thought itself. The figure flared, his outline breaking apart. They feel us, he shouted, though the words were already fading into static. You must hold fast. Remember what you saw. And then he was gone, consumed by the surge. The golden brilliance exploded into white, obliterating all sense of self. For an instant, I was everywhere, in the cathedrals of terror, in the frozen void between stars, in the minds of billions whispering prayers into the dark. I felt the Emperor, his pain, his infinite weariness, his burning necessity. He was no longer a man, no longer even a god, but something caught between. A consciousness stretched across millennia, too vast to die, too broken to rest. And beneath it all, one truth pulsed steady as a heartbeat. The light must not fail. I screamed, or thought I did. But the sound was swallowed by eternity. The light receded, leaving silence, darkness, and the faint echo of a word that refused to die. Endure. The world shifted, and I began to fall again, toward whatever waited below the choir. I woke, if waking could be called the slow surfacing from light into shadow, lying upon a metal dais slick with condensation. The air was heavy, metallic, thick with the scent of oil, blood, and incense that had burned too long. My chest convulsed as breath tore itself back into me. Around me, the chamber trembled with the hum of ancient machinery, and for the first time since the choir consumed me, I felt the boundaries of flesh again. I was alive, or something near it. I blinked, though the world swam in gold. The walls of the sanctum curved upward into darkness, their surfaces alive with conduits pulsing with energy. I could hear it, the heartbeat of the golden throne, vast, deliberate, and eternal. Every beat was 1,000 souls extinguished, every pause another chorus ascending into his light. The sound did not come from any one direction. It was simply everywhere, as if the world itself was breathing with the Emperor's lungs. I tried to move, but my limbs obeyed sluggishly, heavy with the residue of psychic exhaustion. Tubes ran from my wrists and neck into the machinery beside me, feeding something luminous and thin as smoke into the conduits. My blood, or perhaps something deeper, the essence of what had not yet burned away. I reached to pull one free, but the contact with the brass coupling sent a shock through my nerves, and 1,000 images flashed across my mind at once. Worlds burning, cathedrals collapsing, armies kneeling before statues, and through it all, the same sound, the unending chant of humanity clinging to its own survival, for the Emperor, for terror, for the light that must not die. The words throbbed like a pulse through the air, vibrating in my bones. Somewhere beyond the chamber's curve, I could hear others, still bound, still singing through the agony. Not the great choir I had known, but the remnants of those half-consumed, the ones the throne had not yet claimed. They sang without language, their voices raw, primal, human. I turned my head and saw them, a dozen figures strapped to thrones of their own, smaller imitations of the great one above. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, their eyes weeping golden light. Servitors moved among them, adjusting feeds and purging waste. Every motion was mechanical, ritualistic, and there, rising above it all, stood the bridge of the Emperor's machine, a stairway of shining steel that led upward, disappearing into radiance. I could not see where it ended, but I felt it, the presence at the top, vast beyond measure, burning behind layers of psychic shielding and sanctified machinery. The Emperor, the god of mankind, the one who devours us to preserve us. I had seen his shadow before, but this was proximity. My mind trembled beneath it. The psychic field was so immense that it reshaped perception itself. The air hummed with invisible currents that made thoughts echo as if whispered by unseen mouths. I crawled forward, dragging my unsteady limbs across the dais. The tubes tore free from my flesh with wet sounds, spraying faint arcs of light. My hands shook. Every instinct screamed to look away, to fall and pray. But curiosity, or perhaps defiance, drove me onward. I wanted to see. Each step brought the world into sharper focus. The light wasn't light at all, but psychic residue, condensed into something that shimmered like liquid gold. It pooled in the grooves of the floor and trickled toward the great mechanism that dominated the chamber's heart. I followed it upward, toward the blinding source. The noise changed as I ascended. The hum deepened into a pulse, steady, deliberate, as though the Emperor's heart still beat somewhere within the metal colossus. The sound filled me with awe and terror in equal measure. I thought of the figure I had met within the choir, of his warning. The Emperor endures because he must, not because we feed him. Yet here, standing in the heart of his machinery, I could see how wrong, or how right that statement might be. Every cable, every relic, every drop of blood that flowed into the conduits converged at this point, where humanity's God lay entombed in a throne that was both life and prison. Then I saw him, or rather, I saw the suggestion of him, a silhouette enshrined in light so intense that form could not persist. The shape was enormous, seated upon the throne, the contours shifting like heat haze. I could make out the faint impression of armor, ornate, ancient, and the gleam of what might once have been a face, now hidden behind an aura too vast for mortal eyes. The weight of his presence forced me to my knees. My thoughts splintered, every memory in my mind illuminated and burned in an instant. I saw myself as a child, reaching toward the stars. I saw the countless others who had walked this same path, their lives snuffed out to keep the Imperium alive for one more day, and beneath all of it, I felt something impossible, a mind that knew me. For a heartbeat, I was seen, truly seen. A voice, not sound but will, filled the air around me, pressing against my skull until I thought it would split. You are not yet Ash. The force of it nearly drove me unconscious. I gasped, gripping the cold metal floor. The voice was everywhere, behind me, above me, inside me. Ancient beyond time, weary beyond comprehension. You have come far, it said, each word vibrating through my bones. Do you seek understanding? I tried to speak, but the air caught in my throat. My voice was nothing in this place. Then see, the will commanded, and the world shattered into light. Light poured through me like liquid thought. It wasn't illumination, but revelation, a flood that peeled away every lie I had worn as skin. The chamber dissolved. Walls, machines, the trembling choir all bled into a single field of brilliance that pulsed with the cadence of a cosmic heart. I no longer saw with eyes. I saw with memory, with fear, with the raw essence of what it meant to exist beneath the Emperor's gaze. Images coalesced, fragments of history whispered in radiance. I saw terror before the palaces, a world scarred and reborn, the Emperor walking among men not as a god, but as a builder. His hands shaped empires, his eyes carried the weight of all futures. I felt his purpose then, not divinity, but necessity. Humanity needed a shepherd, and he had stepped forward when no one else could. Yet the burden had eaten him alive, century by century, until the throne became both crucifix and engine. The visions sped faster. Legions marching beneath banners of gold, the heresy, flames licking at the very walls of this palace. I saw a son with eyes of burning sorrow, blade raised against the father who had given him everything. The moment froze there, father and son locked in tragedy eternal, and then the light consumed it, the memory collapsing into nothing but the echo of grief. I fell through those memories like a soul descending through aeons. Each fragment I touched burned a new scar into my mind. The Emperor's will wasn't gentle. It was the gravity of a dying star pulling all meaning toward itself. I understood then why his servants spoke in whispers. To comprehend him fully was to be annihilated by comprehension itself. A storm raged within the light, billions of thoughts, prayers, screams from across the Imperium, all converging upon the throne. They collided and broke apart, forming an endless tide of supplication. The Emperor did not answer. He absorbed. Every plea, every death cry, every hymn became sustenance. The realization carved itself into me. He could not choose silence or mercy. He had become function incarnate. The God Emperor no longer ruled. He endured. My consciousness quivered on the edge of that understanding. I felt myself stretching thin, threads of identity pulled taut between worship and horror. Somewhere within that radiance, I heard again the faintest echo of humanity, the voice from the choir who had warned me before. Now you see, the words came wrapped in sorrow. He is not alive as men are alive. The throne binds what remains of him And we, the countless sacrificed, bind the throne. We are the ligaments of a corpse made divine. The voice faltered, as if choked by its own truth. I tried to answer, but thought itself trembled. If he is dead, why does the light still burn? A silence so immense that it felt like time itself had paused. Then, because belief will not allow him to die. The phrase struck deeper than any blade. Across the warp, I sensed it, the collective faith of trillions forming a shell around his fading consciousness, holding it in perpetual stasis. Humanity's worship had become both salvation and curse, imprisoning its God in an eternity of awareness without reprieve. The Emperor's light was no longer a beacon of will, but a mirror reflecting the endless desperation of his species. The brilliance dimmed to a tolerable glow. The machinery of the sanctum returned, and I was kneeling once more on the cold steel floor. My hands smoked faintly where they had touched the surface. The great shape upon the throne loomed above, motionless, silent. I realized I was crying, tears of molten gold streaking down my cheeks. I waited for a word, a sign, anything to make sense of what I had seen. None came. Only the rhythmic pulse of the throne answered, steady and implacable. Somewhere far below, another choir screamed as new voices joined the flame. The cycle continued, indifferent to my revelation. I pressed my forehead to the floor, not in reverence, but in exhausted surrender. I understood the truth of the Imperium now. We did not live for the Emperor. We lived because he could not die. And that was a holiness all its own. A divinity born not of grace, but of endurance. The hum grew louder, the light redoubled. I knew what would come next. The attendants would return, the conduits would reopen, and I would be taken once more into the choir's current. But as I knelt there, trembling before the God who could not rest, one final thought anchored itself in my mind. If faith is what binds him, then perhaps faith could also free him. The chamber shook. Somewhere deep within the machinery, alarms began to wail. Energy flared along the conduits, bright enough to cast shadows that had never existed before. I lifted my head, and for the briefest instant, the figure upon the throne moved. Just a breath, just enough to turn that infinite gaze toward me. And in that impossible silence, I heard a whisper not of command, but of yearning. Release me. The light roared, and the world fell away once more. The roar became everything, a flood of sound and light that shredded thought, burned language, tore prayer apart. I fell through it as a mote falls through fire, weightless, helpless, incandescent. Every instinct screamed to resist. Yet the command that had rung from the throne pulsed through every nerve. Release me. It was impossible, unthinkable, heresy at the scale of creation. And still it filled me, shaping my breath, synchronizing the beat of my heart with the pulse of that divine machine. The vision shifted. I was standing, not kneeling, on the steps of the golden throne. The machinery around me was dim now, its gold turned to a dull bronze. The conduits hissed, and the air shimmered with the scent of ozone and ash. The attendants were gone. Even the servo skulls hovered motionless, their red optics extinguished. I was alone with him. The silhouette on the throne leaned forward just slightly. The light spilling from his form no longer blinded. It flickered, waning, uncertain. What I saw behind it chilled me deeper than any darkness could. A face that might once have been human, features eroded by millennia, eyes that were caverns of light and memory. When he spoke, the words came without sound, carried directly into the marrow of thought. Do you see it now? I see everything, I whispered, though my voice was little more than air. Then you know what I am. I hesitated. You are the Emperor. You are humanity's God. The light trembled, like a dying flame. Once perhaps. Now I am the echo of a man chained to a promise. The throne feeds, and I feed the throne. Endless, unbroken. But even eternity decays. The words resonated with a grief too vast for comprehension. It was not despair. It was fatigue so deep that it had become the nature of his being. I don't understand, I managed. If you die, the light fails. The Imperium falls. And so they keep me from dying, he answered, by binding billions to this engine. by feeding me the minds of my children. They call it faith. I call it noise. I felt the edges of his perception brushing against mine, warm, invasive, electric. My memories spilled open like books thrown into a storm. Every moment of my life unfolded before him. The first whisper of the Scholastia's tests, the sterile corridors of the Psykana, my mother's face fading into the warp. All of it flickered through his consciousness and was known. When he spoke again, his tone softened. You are not meant to be here, yet you endure. Why? I swallowed hard. Because someone told me to. A silence followed, filled with the low hum of the throne's core. Then, faintly, I felt amusement, ancient and sad. Endure. The echo rolled through the chamber. Yes, the last virtue of a dying species. He leaned forward once more, and the pressure of his presence grew unbearable. The golden light pierced straight through my skin, exposing bone, thought, soul. Listen, child of terror. The Astronomicon burns upon the faith of mankind, yet it chains me tighter with every prayer. They think they keep me alive. In truth, they bind me to unlife. I cannot ascend, cannot fade, cannot rest. I am the cage, and I am the prisoner. The realization struck me like a hammer. The Emperor's immortality was not triumph. It was torment perpetuated by the devotion of a trillion voices. Every whisper of praise, every act of sacrifice was another bar solid into his endless confinement. My knees buckled. What do you want me to do? The light dimmed to a smoldering gold, like the last embers of a dying sun. Remember, he said simply. Remember what you have seen when you return to the song. Tell no one, yet let the truth live inside you. There will come a day when the machine stutters, when silence falls across the choir. Then, speak my name, not as God but as man. I wanted to promise, to swear obedience, but words were already crumbling under the weight of his gaze. Go now, he said. You will fall again, you will burn, but a fragment of you will remain unbound. That is enough. The throne erupted in light. I felt the pull again, the inexorable drag back into the current of the choir. The chamber stretched, the air liquefied, and the golden aura devoured all distinction between self and space. My body dissolved first, then thought, until only a sliver of consciousness remained, clinging to the last echo of his command. Remember, the brilliance folded inward, collapsing into a single point, and then silence. No hum, no chant, only the faint throb of the warp pressing in like the breath of a sleeping giant. The darkness returned, soft and absolute. I was falling once more through the currents of the choir, toward the world beyond the throne's sanctum. Yet something within me had changed. The faith that had once been blind now burned with knowing, terrible clarity. I was not a martyr. I was a witness. And as I plunged into the golden storm again, I felt other minds reach toward me, curious, hungry, half awake. Perhaps they too had heard a whisper from the dying god. Perhaps the Emperor's plea was spreading, one soul at a time. The thought flickered, bright as defiance, before the light took me once more. There was no boundary between death and what came after, only the endless echo of light collapsing into silence. The choir's song still vibrated through me, but now it was different, fractured, as though the harmony had splintered into 1,000 unresolved chords. I drifted somewhere between the living and the lost, surrounded by the residue of minds burned clean by the throne. They whispered in faint, fading patterns, their voices carried by psychic currents that shimmered like auroras through the dark. I understood now what this place was. It wasn't heaven, it wasn't hell. It was the warp's reflection of faith, a liminal tide where the remnants of thought were sifted and devoured by the Imperium. Here, the Emperor's radiance faded into distance, a dim, receding star. Beyond it, the warp stretched infinite and hungry, alive with the movement of unseen giants. The psychic dead drifted through it like ash in the wind. I could feel them brushing against me, traces of the choir, the billions who had perished before me. Their essence shimmered and dissipated as they collided, merging into one another until individuality ceased. Yet within that sea of oblivion, I remained distinct. The Emperor's command had carved a mark upon my being. Remember, it bound me, shielded me, separated me from dissolution. Time, if it still existed here, had no direction. I felt myself moving and standing still all at once. Then slowly, the darkness began to pulse. Each beat sent ripples through the warp, faint at first, then growing stronger, like the breathing of some great creature stirring from slumber. The ripples carried echoes, thoughts not my own, but familiar. The first was terror, worlds crying out as storms of unreality tore at their skies. I saw fleets adrift, navigators screaming as the Astronomicon faltered for the briefest instant, its light flickering like a candle in wind. The choir's rhythm stuttered, and for a moment, humanity's path through the void wavered. I felt the tremor of it ripple outward across the galaxy. The second echo was anger, the wrath of the warp itself. Predators sensed weakness, entities older than stars turning their formless heads toward terror's beacon. The Emperor's silence was a wound they could smell across eternity. I saw them in flashes, shapes without name, colors that bled into madness, laughter that had no sound. They pressed against the veil, eager, waiting, and the third echo was sorrow. It came not from the warp, but from within the light itself, faint, human, and unbearably lonely. It was the echo of the Emperor's will, reverberating through the Imperium like a dying heartbeat. I could hear it now with clarity I had not before, the yearning of a being who could no longer pray, only remember that he once could. It wasn't command or control that sustained the Astronomicon anymore. It was memory. The Emperor remembered humanity, and in doing so, humanity continued to exist. I moved toward the source, drawn not by choice, but inevitability. The psychic sea thickened as I descended through it. The air, if it could be called that, heavy with residue. Thoughts half-born, dreams unspoken, fear unending. I passed through drifting clusters of what had once been souls. They flickered as I neared, mouthing silent pleas. Don't let it fade. Don't let him forget. Don't let the light die. Each voice left a trace within me, a spark that refused to extinguish. I realized then that I carried more than memory. I carried witness. Every death, every prayer, every mind consumed by the throne lingered faintly within me. A lattice of remembrance bound by the Emperor's last plea. I wasn't meant to survive. I was meant to bear the truth. The current shifted again. Ahead, something vast loomed in the dark. A monolith of psychic gravity, its edges blurred by unreality. It pulsed with alternating light and shadow, rhythm like breath. The closer I drifted, the louder the hum became. The same pulse I'd felt in the sanctum, now magnified to infinity. Then from its core a voice emerged. Not words, not even thought, but intent. It struck through me with the force of an orbital strike, bending space and sense alike. You still exist. The realization hit me like a blow. It was him. Not the fractured echo of worship that filled the choir, but the Emperor himself, or what was left of his consciousness drifting beyond the throne's confines. His awareness burned here, distant yet undeniable, a fragment of divinity that refused to fade completely. I knelt instinctively, though there was no ground beneath me. You called me, I thought, or perhaps said. The difference no longer mattered. I remember you, the voice replied, the words rolling through the warp like thunder. You bore my light. You saw my prison. I don't know what to do, I confessed. I'm nothing now, dust in your fire. The presence shuddered, vast and weary. Nothing is ever nothing, not while it is remembered. Around us, the warp writhed. Storm fronts of energy colliding, tearing reality's seams. I could feel the psychic predators moving closer, drawn by the resonance of his thought. The Emperor's fragment trembled, the light around it flickering. They come, he said, voice fading into the static of collapsing existence, and I am too weak to hold them all. The realization chilled me deeper than any void could. The Astronomicon's light was faltering, and with it, the Emperor's hold on the warp. Humanity's shield trembled, and even the gods of chaos paused to listen. What can I do? I begged. How can I help you? The light dimmed further. Then, with the quiet of a dying sun, the Emperor's voice whispered the words that would change everything. Remember and speak. The warp convulsed. The vision shattered. I was flung outward, carried by psychic currents that screamed with the voices of the lost. And somewhere, far away, the light of terror flickered once more, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. I was falling through eternity again. But this time I understood that eternity was not a line. It was a storm, a ceaseless maelstrom of thought and memory, where the dead were not gone, only reshaped. The warp folded and unfolded like lungs breathing, each inhalation pulling me deeper, each exhalation scattering fragments of what I once was into the churning void. Around me, voices multiplied, not the mechanical chorus of the Astronomicon, but something rawer, older, human. They rose in tides, countless and broken, each one a memory of faith turned to madness. Some whispered prayers that had never been answered. Others laughed softly, their sanity long surrendered. They did not speak to me. They spoke through me, as though I were a passage between worlds. The Emperor's last command echoed within me still. Remember and speak. I did not yet know what it meant. Words seemed pointless here, where sound became light and light became hunger. Yet that command pulsed in rhythm with the warp itself, as if even the Imperium recognized its weight. I drifted past the remnants of the choir. Their psychic signatures flared briefly as I neared. Faint constellations of burned souls, still orbiting the gravitational pull of Terra's light. Each one hummed with residual devotion, a frequency of faith too stubborn to die. I reached out, and in that instant, our essences touched. Their thoughts flooded into me, centuries of agony, of yearning, of blind belief that one day the pain would end. The enormity of it broke something inside me, but beneath the grief, I felt something else. Defiance, faint, nearly imperceptible, yet undeniably there. A resonance that did not belong to worship, but to will. The spark of humanity itself, surviving even in the warp-born afterlife. We were not meant to last beyond sacrifice, and yet somehow we did. The current pulled me onward. The gold light of the Emperor's presence receded into the distance until it became a faint star in the dark. I could sense the edges of the warp stretching infinitely around me now, a cathedral of chaos and color without geometry. There were shapes there, watching. They did not move in the way things move in the material world. They shifted by thought, by appetite. They had no faces, and yet I knew they smiled. The predators of the Imperium, the gods whose names men dared not speak without trembling, stirred in curiosity. They had felt the flicker in the Astronomicon, the brief pause when the Emperor's light had wavered. Their hunger was the gravity of the warp itself, and it pulled at everything that remembered life. I felt their attention like claws tracing my thoughts. They wanted to know what I carried, the echo of his voice, the truth that he had whispered. I tried to hide, to still my mind, but here, thought was movement. My fear made me shine brighter, and the darkness rushed closer. Their laughter was a feeling, not a sound, sweet and cruel, like promises made in the dark. Then a shockwave rolled through the warp, and the laughter ceased. A sound, impossible, beautiful, terrible, rippled across the void. The choir had begun again. The Astronomicon had stabilized. Terra's light flared to life, cutting across the warp like a blade. The predators recoiled, their forms unraveling into the background chaos. The tide shifted. And for a moment, I felt the Emperor's presence again. Distant, fractured, yet steady. The light endures. The whisper came, faint but resolute. As long as one remembers, I understood now what he had meant. The warp is not merely an enemy, it is a mirror. It reflects belief, magnifies it, twists it, sustains it. The Emperor's power was not in machinery or sacrifice, but in the persistence of the human soul, in memory. Each Psyker, each pilgrim, each worshipper across the galaxy added to that reflection. And as long as someone still believed, he could not fade. The realization tore through me like light through stained glass. I was part of that reflection now, one of countless fragments scattered through the Imperium, bound together by memory. I felt the other remnants turning toward me, drawn by the resonance of awareness. The faint network of the lost began to hum again, faint and fragile, like the first vibration before a symphony. Maybe this was the Emperor's true design. Not a single voice commanding from a throne, but a chorus of billions whispering across eternity, keeping the light alive one memory at a time. As the warp settled back into uneasy calm, I felt the current shift once more. It was drawing me upward, towards something brighter. Not the blinding light of terror, but a softer glow, distant and inviting. The border between the Imperium and reality. I could feel the weight of the material world calling me back, the echo of lungs and heartbeat and time. The Emperor's voice faded, but the echo of his final words remained, etched into the core of what I had become. Remember, and speak. The warp folded around me like wings of light, and I began to rise toward that distant glow, carrying with me every soul that had whispered across the void. The light ahead shimmered like a memory half forgotten, its borders wavering as if reality itself resisted being touched. I moved toward it with no body to propel me, only the momentum of will. Each thought I formed rippled outward in rings of pale gold, drawing fragments of other minds along in my wake. They drifted beside me, remnants of the choir, faint sparks that had not yet dissolved. Some hummed softly, others clung to silence, but all followed the pull of that light, as though remembering what it felt like to breathe. The barrier between the warp and the waking world trembled. I felt it before I saw it. The pulse of physics, the taste of air, the faintest whisper of gravity. Then came sound, the low thunder of machinery, the constant litany of the faithful repeating prayers through vox grills and steel corridors. I was being drawn back toward terror, to the endless catacombs beneath the palace where the living still burned in service to the throne. The passage was agony. The immaterium clung to me, reluctant to release what it had already claimed. Every step towards substance tore away pieces of light, pieces of the souls that had followed me. I tried to hold them together, but the pull of reality was merciless. One by one, the sparks winked out, whispering gratitude as they vanished into the Emperor's echo. Their parting left a silence that felt like mourning. When I finally breached the veil, I emerged into darkness, not the void of space, but the dim half-light of the catacombs. The air was warm and wet, vibrating with the hum of conduits. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing stone walls slick with condensation and the faint shimmer of holy oils. I was lying on the floor beside a chamber door, naked and shivering, my breath clouded in the cold. Around me, attendants in red robes chanted prayers of maintenance, their voices steady, oblivious to my presence. To them, I was just another spent psyker waiting for the reclamation servitors. The realization struck like cold iron. They thought I was dead. Perhaps I was, my heart beat, yet I could still feel the warp whispering in rhythm with it. Life and afterlife had tangled inside me, inseparable. I rose unsteadily. No one noticed. The adepts moved past with data slates and incense sensors, their eyes hidden behind augmetic lenses. Above, the pipes sang faintly with psychic residue, the song of the choir continuing its endless labor. For a moment, I simply stood there, feeling the vibration pass through the floor into my bones. It was the sound of humanity's survival and of its bondage. Then I remembered his words, remember and speak. The command had followed me out of death. It throbbed behind my ribs like a second pulse. Speak to whom? What could I possibly say that would not condemn me as heretic or mad? Yet silence now felt like betrayal. I had seen the truth. The Emperor was neither god nor corpse, but a will caught between, sustained by the devotion that imprisoned him. And he had asked for release. A shudder passed through the floor as the throne's engines flared again. I felt it deep in my skull, the distant surge of power that consumed 1,000 more lives. The attendants crossed themselves with gestures of devotion. I fell to my knees, not in prayer but in grief. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began to wail, a low, mournful tone signaling instability in the psychic conduits. I felt the pressure of the warp rising, the ripple of fear moving through the adepts as they adjusted their instruments. But within that chaos, I sensed something else. Faint whispers moving through the network of minds that formed the choir. They were repeating words that were not part of any litany. Remember. The word echoed through the chamber, soft at first, then louder as more voices took it up. Adepts looked around in confusion, unable to trace the source. It passed through every speaker, every rebreather grill, every vox line like a breath of wind. Remember. The syllables carried weight, not defiance, but awakening. I felt tears rise, hot and human. Perhaps the souls that had followed me through the warp had found their way back too, scattering across the choir like sparks in dry grass. Their memory was catching fire. I pressed my palm to the cold floor, feeling the pulse of the throne beneath. It no longer felt indifferent. It felt aware. The Emperor's voice whispered faintly through the vibration, no longer commanding, only weary. It begins. The alarm ceased. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The adepts resumed their work, unaware that something immeasurable had shifted. I rose, trembling, and took my first steps away from the chamber. My body was weak, my mind fractured, but inside me burned the echo of a dying god and the chorus of a billion souls. I would carry them into the world above, where faith was law and truth was treason, and when the time came, I would speak. The tunnels of the Imperial Palace were endless. I walked through them as a shade might drift through a dream. Barefoot, half blind, the echo of the throne's pulse still beating in my bones. The air was thick with incense and machine oil, the hymns of maintenance priests rising from unseen galleries like the murmurs of the dead. Above, the weight of the palace pressed down, a mountain of gold and sorrow built upon the bones of 10,000 years. I moved through it as if through a memory, not sure if I truly existed or if I was simply the thought of one who had already burned. Everywhere I went, I saw devotion. Servitors carved with holy sigils dragged censers the size of tanks. Penitent pilgrims crawled along the floor, their tongues rasping against the sacred metal. Cherubim drifted overhead, their wings shedding dust that glowed faintly in the half-light. Every sound was a prayer, every breath was worship. Yet beneath it all, I could still hear the deeper rhythm, the slow, exhausted heart of the throne, beating through the stone like the pulse of a dying sun. When I passed through the Shrine of Martyrs, a priest stopped me. His robes were the color of dried blood, his face lost behind a mask of bone. He raised a hand, trembling with both age and fervor. "Child," he said softly, "you bear the scent of sanctification. Have you come from the depths?" I nodded, unable to speak. He bowed low, the gesture of one greeting a relic. "Then you are blessed beyond all knowing. The Emperor has touched you." Touched, yes, burned, broken, remade. I looked into his hollow eyes and saw faith so pure it no longer needed truth. He could not imagine that the God he served might suffer, might long for release. To him, the Emperor's silence was majesty, not mourning. I envied him that ignorance. As I continued upward, the air grew colder. The corridors widened, lined with statues of custodians carved from living stone. Each held a blade pointed toward the heavens, their faces serene and terrible. The torches here burned blue, their flames consuming nothing, their light refracting in the thin incense haze. I passed beneath their gaze, feeling both smaller and heavier. And still, the whispers followed me. Remember, they came from the walls, the vents, the hum of the machines. Pilgrims paused mid-prayer, heads tilting as though hearing some distant call. The adepts exchanged glances, confused. Even the servo skulls hesitated in their flight paths. The words spread through the air like a scent, invisible but undeniable. Remember, somewhere deep below, I could feel the choir resonating, their collective consciousness stirring in ways the priests would not understand. The voices that had followed me out of the warp were awakening others. Memory was rippling through the hive mind of devotion like light beneath ice. When I reached the outer sanctum, the first sunlight I had seen in what felt like eternities spilled across the floor. Terra's sky was no longer blue. It was the color of ash and gold, heavy with pollution and the ceaseless offerings of the faithful. Yet to me, it was the most beautiful thing imaginable. It was proof that life still persisted above the machinery of sacrifice. I fell to my knees and wept. Each tear left trails of faint luminescence on my skin, remnants of the warp's touch. They glowed like constellations before fading one by one. I pressed my palms to the cold marble and whispered the words I had carried back from death. He remembers us. The pilgrims nearby turned, startled. Some crossed themselves. One woman dropped her relic in shock. But others simply listened. Their eyes widened as if hearing something familiar yet long forgotten. I could feel their hearts trembling in the same rhythm as my own. In that moment, I knew the Emperor's silence was not absence. It was waiting for someone to listen, waiting for the truth to find a voice in the sea of endless prayer. I rose slowly, the sound of the throne still echoing behind me, and looked toward the horizon where the light of the Astronomicon touched the clouds like the faint outline of a dying star. I was one voice, small and finite, yet the warp had taught me this much. In the Imperium of Man, even a whisper can become eternal. And so, I began to walk, not back toward the palace, nor toward the pilgrim gates, but outward, into the vast sprawl of terror, where the forgotten billions waited for hope. The choir hummed behind me. The word followed on the wind, remember. The upper reaches of terror were drowned in light. Sunlight diffused through the pollution haze. neon banners flickering, the faint glow of orbital stations sliding across the ash-colored sky. I had never seen the surface like this before. It was too wide, too alive, billions of lives pressed together in prayer and ignorance, each heartbeat a grain of dust in the cathedral that was humanity. I walked among them unnoticed, a ghost in the garments of the forgotten. Every street was a shrine. Walls were etched with the aquila, the double-headed sigil watching over every breath. The air vibrated with hymns broadcast from vox towers. I could taste iron, smoke, devotion. To these people, the emperor was not a man chained to a throne. He was the sun itself, the breath between seconds. They did not know the sound of his silence, nor the weight of his sorrow. Perhaps they never should. I wandered through a market square where pilgrims traded relics, flaked paint from sacred walls, shavings of holy metal, locks of hair sealed in glass. A preacher stood upon a pedestal, his arms raised high. "He sees you all," he shouted, voice shaking with ecstasy. "He burns with love for every soul." The crowd wept. I felt no anger, only the ache of knowing how much truth can wound those who live on faith. The whispers followed me still. "Remember," and "speak." They threaded through the noise of the city like wind through broken glass. At first I thought they came only to me, but soon I saw faces turn. Pilgrims pausing mid-prayer, clerks dropping their censers. The word was spreading, invisible yet unstoppable. Memory was contagion. I reached the edge of the great plaza where the palace walls rose like mountains of gold and stone. The light from the throne diffused upward, turning the air into liquid radiance. My body trembled as the pulse reached me. Slower now, heavier. I knew it instinctively. The Emperor's strength was fading. The Astronomicon still burned, but its rhythm faltered, like a candle guttering in unseen wind. I fell to my knees in the dust. The crowd parted around me, uncertain. My voice, when it came, was soft, almost a whisper. "He remembers us," I said. "And he asks us to remember him, not as God, but as man." Some turned away in fear. Others froze, their eyes wide, lips trembling as the phrase took root inside them. For a heartbeat, the entire plaza seemed to hold its breath. Then a child repeated the words. Then another voice. Then 100. "He remembers us." It spread like song, fragile and terrible. I felt the warp stir in response, a distant shiver through the unseen fabric of the world. The choir beneath the palace caught the resonance and echoed it without knowing why. Through the psychic tides, I sensed the Emperor's awareness flare faintly. No command, no fury, just acknowledgement, gratitude. His silence no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Guards began to move through the crowd, their armor gleaming, their orders sharp and urgent. The Vox Towers crackled with warnings against heresy, but the words had already escaped. You cannot cage a thought once it has learned to sing. I stepped back into the shadow of the palace walls, unseen, the murmur following me like a heartbeat. The throne's pulse slowed once more, steadying itself against the tide. Somewhere deep below, the machinery of sacrifice continued its work. Yet for the first time in 10,000 years, there was space within the Emperor's silence for something that was not duty, something like peace. I looked up at the dying light of the sky and whispered, "Rest, Father of Man, we will endure." And in the distance, faint as the last echo of a dream, the Astronomicon flared, not brighter, but gentler, as if the universe itself had exhaled. The golden light that had once been pain became calm. The silence that had once been absence became promise. Faith did not die that day. It changed shape, and humanity, still kneeling in the shadow of its God, began to remember